Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, A Beginner's Guide to Histamine and DAO. My name is Tom Martin, and I'll be handling the technology today. As an aside, we are recording today's webinar, and a copy of the recording, including the Q&A, will be made available to you tomorrow. It will be emailed to the link that the email address you registered with. We are very pleased to have international food allergy and intolerance expert, Dr. Janice Joneja. Dr. Joneja holds a PhD in medical microbiology and immunology. She was a registered dietitian in Canada and a member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics in the USA for 27 years. For 13 years, she was the head of the Allergy Nutrition Clinic at the Vancouver Hospital and Health Sciences Center. She is an author of 10 books and numerous peer-reviewed scientific and medical journals. We want to be respectful of your time today, so we've asked Dr. Joneja to keep her planned remarks to about 15 to 20 minutes so that we can allow ample time for Q&A, which we will handle at the end of her presentation. To ask a question, simply use the Q&A option, which you should see at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. All questions will be held in the queue for Dr. Joneja, and she'll attempt to answer as many as she can before we conclude today's event. If your question, for whatever reason, cannot be answered during our webinar, a member of the Diem Labs team will follow up with you directly post-event to attempt to answer that question for you. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Joneja. Welcome, ma'am. The stage is now yours.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I want to talk a little bit, first of all, about histamine. Many of you who are now listening have the problems that you identify as histamine intolerance. And of course, many people are very familiar with antihistamines. And so in both conditions, we're looking at histamine as the enemy. Somehow we've got to tame this factor that's causing such grief in the body. But first of all, let's just look at histamine for a minute, because we really couldn't live without it. And that is an important start to see how we are going to deal with the problems associated with histamine. Now, histamine is a natural compound. It plays a number of important roles in the human body. And first of all, it is an important neurotransmitter. It's very important in brain and central nervous system functioning. It acts by conveying signals between nerve cells. Without it, we would not be able to, our brains simply wouldn't function as they do. Secondly, it's important in digestion. This is a fact that many people don't recognize, but it actually triggers the release of gastric acid in the stomach, and that's the start of protein digestion. Without that, protein would be inadequately digested as it passes through the digestive tract and end up in the colon where it gets fermented. So histamine is a key factor there. And very importantly, it's an essential component of immunological protection. In fact, it's a key mediator in defending the body from threats such as infection, trauma, or anything that actually is going to compromise the body's health. So looking at all of those wonderful things that histamine does, why is it such a problem for so many people? It really only becomes a problem when it is present in such quantities that are in excess of the body's requirements. It's then that we see the real problems of excess histamine in the sense of intolerance, or, as we see very often, the effects of allergy. Now, histamine is a very important agent in food allergy of any type, in fact. It is an inflammatory mediator that is actually released from mast cells. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And these mediators are responsible for the symptoms of allergy. Now, because it's such an important mediator, it is clinically very difficult to distinguish it from food allergy. And so many people think they have food allergy, they go to their allergists, they have all the allergy tests, and everything comes back negative. And so everyone is perplexed. Well, I've got all these symptoms. I know that I eat food and I get a reaction, and yet you're telling me that I have no food allergy. And so often people are directed to various specialists, and so often in my practice I've seen patients told that it's all in your head, go and live with it kind of thing. And they become very distressed. They start looking for answers in all sorts of places. But fortunately, now, due to a lot more research which is being undertaken in various parts of the world, histamine sensitivity is being recognized and seen as actually a distinct condition separate from allergy. Now, what is histamine sensitivity? What it really means is that a person is experiencing the high level of histamine in excess of what the body needs and can cope with. Examples of that are often listed as idiopathic. In other words, we don't know what the reason is, but we know you've got a condition. And these are conditions that we can actually see. Urticaria, which is hives, and angioedema, which is swelling of deeper tissue in response to a non-allergic trigger. There are examples of histamine excess, which we can describe as histamine sensitivity or histamine intolerance. Let's look at a few of the symptoms of excess histamine. We've got this big word, vasodilatation. What that means is that histamine causes a widening of blood vessels. Now, what that means is histamine is actually acting as in its protective role, and as soon as there's a threat to the body, then the histamine causes blood vessels to widen so that more blood and protective immunological factors can be taken to the reaction site. Now, what that excess blood causes, of course, is flushing and reddening. That's because the blood vessels are now allowing more blood to the site. Hypertension, that's a drop in blood pressure. That widening of the blood vessels causes less pressure against the heart, so it speeds up. And in a method to try to get the same amount of blood through the body, so it speeds up, and that causes an increased heart rate, which in itself can cause problems, because with an increased heart rate, there could be these feelings of anxiety, panic attacks, chest pain, a lot of symptoms that might in fact mimic a heart attack. Then we've got increased vascular permeability. What that means is that the blood vessels become more permeable. So fluid moves from inside the blood vessels into tissues and causes swelling, reddening, and we get hives, deeper tissue swelling. The swelling in the nose causes rhinitis, which is a stuffy nose, rhinorrhea, which is when the fluid moves from the tissues out, and a runny nose occurs, and earache, where the pressure of the excess fluid in the little canals in the ear causes the pain of earache. We've got itching caused by histamine. Histamine anywhere can be accompanied by itching. And so itching all over the body is a sign that there's histamine there somewhere for some reason. Then an increase in gastric secretions, as I've already mentioned. Histamine triggers the release of gastric acid. And if there's too much of that, you get heartburn and reflux, which again can be caused by an increase in the histamine triggering that response. Headaches because of the neurotransmitter factors, the symptoms of anxiety and panic due to the increased heart rate, fatigue, listlessness, confusion, and even in extreme cases, there can be a momentary fainting, a very quick loss of consciousness. It only lasts a very few seconds, but they're all very miserable symptoms when people are dealing with that situation. Now, why does histamine become so high? Why is it, in fact, in excess? Well, let's look at the way that histamine is controlled. Very briefly, it's controlled by two enzyme systems. These are called histamine N-methyltransferase, HMT, HNMT, and diamine oxidase. Diamine oxidase is an enzyme that rapidly degrades histamine. What it does, it degrades it to its metabolites. They're called imidazole compounds, and they're excreted in urine. It more or less acts as a scavenger. It circulates around the body, picking up any excess that's not required and getting rid of it. It also is present in the digestive tract, and there it will mix with anything passing through, which is usually the dietary factors, and will break down the histamine and get rid of it before it can enter the body. So it's diamine oxidase. You can just imagine in this diagram, it's just floating around the body, in and outside the body, outside being in the digestive tract, and getting rid of the excess. Now, HNMT is, it's got a very different role in most cases. It, when histamine acts and causes any effect, good or bad, it actually has to couple with a cell. And the coupling occurs through receptors. And the receptors, they're named in the order in which they were discovered: H1R, H2R, H3R, and H4R. There are 4 different types, and they're all on different cells. And it's to these that histamine attaches and causes its effects. Now, when it's finished its job, histamine has to be removed, and HMT actually is the enzyme that removes it from the cell. So HMT removes the histamine when it's done its job, and then diamine oxidase comes along and gets rid of it. That works beautifully, except in the brain. Diamine oxidase doesn't enter the brain. The HMT actually is the factor that breaks it down in the brain. So both enzymes have some effects, but it's diamine oxidase which is the most important factor for controlling controlling histamine. Now, where do we find histamine that is in outside the body? How, in fact, does histamine rise when it is in excess? Well, first of all, we have to consider, before we look at external sources of histamine, where does histamine come from inside the body? And the excess I'm talking about now, where do we get the excess histamine from inside the body? And this can be due to a number of factors. One is mast cell activation disorders, because mast cells are the cells that actually store histamine. They make it, they store it, and keep it ready for release when it's required for any of the functions I mentioned previously. Now, if there are too many mast cells, there's going to be too much histamine, as well as the other inflammatory mediators, which we see in allergy. The mast cells will then produce too much histamine. An allergy will produce too much histamine. Any inflammatory process within the body will actually have too much histamine. So there are many factors within the body that are responsible for excess histamine. But there's the external sources of histamine that we can actually control. We can't, and unless we are using specific medications and the conditions have been identified, personally we can't do much about the internal histamine, but external histamine we can manage to a certain extent. And that is by controlling the amount that comes from external sources, mainly from our diets. Now, histamine is produced by microbial action. In many of the foods that contain histamine, it's due to microbial action. And in the manufacture of foods such as cheese, fermented meats and sausages, wine, beers, vinegar, yeast extracts, sauerkraut, any process that depends on microbial action is likely to contain histamine. Histidine is the amino acid that is what we call the precursor to histamine. Histamine comes from histidine that is converted by an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase. And this can be found in many, many different microorganisms, principally bacteria. And we see this where it can actually cause its problems in, for example, anything where the gut of the food, in fact in fish, where a fish is not gutted, the microorganisms in the gut will start to break down the protein in the fish flesh. The protein will contain the amino acid histidine, and the microorganisms in the gut will convert the histidine to histamine quite rapidly. So if the food, the fish has not been immediately gutted or immediately frozen, then we have a rise in histamine in the fish itself. A freshly caught fish doesn't contain any histamine, but it will rapidly develop within the fish if it's improperly processed or refrigerated, especially this list here: tuna, mackerel, bonito, bluefish, mahi, and shellfish, which we don't gut, and therefore shellfish is a problem for anyone who is histamine intolerant or sensitive. Some foods naturally contain histamine. Spinach is one, aubergine or eggplant is another one. And some foods we found develop histamine during the ripening process. Examples of this are tomatoes. The red tomatoes actually do contain quite a bit of histamine, but if you can get them in the green state, some species are green, and before ripening they're green. They don't contain too much histamine. It's the ripening process that actually is responsible for the increase in histamine. Cherries are another fruit that seems to develop histamine as it ripens. There are others that release histamine through non-immunologically mediated mechanisms. Egg white, alcohol, citrus fruits. With strawberries that I got in this list, actually, the mechanism is known. And berries actually are releasing histamine as a result of their content of benzoates. The benzoates in certain foods will release histamine if they're eaten in large quantities. So those berries are on the list of histamine-releasing foods. And also benzoates used as preservatives can release histamine. Other additives that can release histamine are tartrazine. That's a yellow dye, which is quite commonly used in some foods, and other azo dyes. Azo means including nitrogen-containing dyes, and coloring agents. So we avoid, on a histamine-restricted diet, we would avoid tartrazine, other azo dyes, and coloring agents. Sulfites may release histamine. So these, on anyone who is controlling their histamine intake from their diet, will avoid these additives. On the other hand, we've got some compounds that actually block the action of diamine and histamine and methyltransferase. Alcohol, some antidepressants, and some pain relievers, and H2 blockers. H2 is the one of the receptors that I was speaking about earlier. H2 is the receptor to which histamine couples in its role in releasing gastric acid. Now, diamine oxidase, as I mentioned previously, is secreted into the digestive tract, and it's the first-line defense against histamine ingested through the diet or released within the digestive tract. So it mixes with the food as it passes through the digestive tract and breaks down the excess histamine, stops it from being absorbed, so it is a defensive enzyme in the sense that it doesn't allow large quantities of histamine to enter the body. When diamine oxidase levels in the body are inadequate, those may be due to a deficiency of diamine oxidase. This is often an inherited characteristic. There are certain genes that actually code for the production of diamine oxidase and HN-methyltransferase. And if these are deficient, a person, even consuming a normal diet, will probably not be able to manage the amount of histamine in their diet because the enzymes are not up to the job. So what we want to do in a person who is histamine intolerant or histamine sensitive from any cause, which could be a deficiency in the enzymes that break down their histamine, or be producing large quantities of histamine due to some factor within the body, which could be a disease condition. What we need is a histamine-restricted diet to reduce all the sources of histamine that we know in the diet, and also to supplement with diamine oxidase to mix it with any residual histamine which may be in the food so that it can be broken down before it enters the body. So looking at diamine oxidase supplements, they should be taken prior to consumption of histamine-rich food, so they start their activity as soon as the food enters the body. The diamine oxidase supplements probably will help with anyone who is taking medications that can reduce that may block diamine oxidase activity. And supplementation can be helpful, but dietary restrictions really in conjunction with the supplementation are essential. And the reason for this is, and this is something that is not generally understood, is that especially foods which are fermented don't just contain histamine. They also contain a number of other biogenic amines, things such as putrescine, cadaverine, phenylethylamine, and serine. Some of these biogenic amines are also broken down by diamine oxidase, which more or less diverts its activity from histamine. And so taking fermented foods at the same time as a diamine oxidase supplement, and if the person also has a deficiency, is actually going to make things very difficult to reduce the histamine below a person's limit of tolerance. Their limit of tolerance is how we describe the amount of histamine that a person's body can contain before they actually have symptoms, which are the indicators of excess. So these can be very effective strategies for managing histamine sensitivity, that is, a histamine-restricted diet in conjunction with perhaps a diamine oxidase supplement.